So I'm going to start with sort of talking about the differences between the live software and the T software, because actually for 95% of what the console does, it's the same. The processing doesn't change. The only exception in processing changes in the matrix, where we have nodal delays as part of theatre software. But the rest of it, is the same, and quite rightly. The live version of the software is very capable, and the snapshot section is, really detailed and offers huge amount of flexibility. And if you know what you're doing, you can sort of emulate quite a lot of what T sort of does. But obviously, the main focus today is all about cue data manipulation, I suppose. And that's sort of the big thing that is different between the live software and the T software, the way we manipulate it. And I'm going to make sort of references to what I think is a big three-dimensional spreadsheet of what the data is, in terms of cues and modules and channels and what have you. So we're going to sort of talk about that. Other than that, when you start a session in T, there's no master bus, because generally you're going to route everything and mix everything via the matrix. All the channels start muted. Just as some work surface things that are very different to the way the live software works. But other than that, it's very much the same. So we're going to have a look at some of the options and run through some of the T-specific options on the theatre in terms of the way you might set the desk up. And then I'm going to start with the famous how to get to Q1, which is quite an involved process in terms of the programming workflow. And there's lots of important steps that we think you ought to take before you get to that point of making your first cue. And I'm going to demonstrate some of the reasons why. It's not that the console won't work or won't perform the functions that you would like it to perform, but from a housekeeping, neat and tidiness point of view, actually some of these steps are, I think, really important. So we're going to start with the options. When you enable the theatre software, you get this additional page of choices. And in this version of software, there's going to be some new things in this, or more options that you might not have seen before, but the principle about it is all the same as we've done previously. So we'll sort of run from top to bottom, because that's logical and easy. The optional button, this is our biggest friend, probably our biggest friend in T software programming. In live mode, the optional does channels and gangs, and by default, that's what this is set to here. In T mode, generally, we would have it in this Q auto update mode. I actually like to put this on a macro, and depending on what you're doing, there may be times when it's handy to have that gangs mode available. But for the most part, you're going to have it in the Q auto update mode. And it's a function that allows you to write specific data or modify the way data is written to the console as you're programming and running through your cues. And it's sort of linked to auto update, which I will explain for those that, haven't heard me do it before, at least. The next section down is the auto update exclusions. So the principle of auto update is it writes data to the cues automatically all the time. You never have to. In programming these consoles, really, the points that you have to press the update selected button are very few and far between. It's something which we try and avoid people doing. So auto update automatically writes data across your cue list all the time. But there are some functions of channels that you would only want it to write to the cue you're in, as opposed to write it across your entire cue list. Mute being the obvious one. If you were to hit a mute and that wrote it automatically across all your cues, that would make no sense, because you end up with that channel muted in all your cues. So this exclusion, this update, is basically saying, when I do this function, I'm going to automatically write it to just the cue I'm in versus all the cues. And you can come in and change this scope anytime you like, and it's going to, from that point onwards, write it either to one cue or all cues. Quite often we'll start like this, but actually, it may be that delays are in, because the moment you go and make a delay change, the chances are it's just for the cue you're in, because it's for an artistic sound design result, rather than I want this channel delayed all the time. So you can choose what So while we call it exclusion, pressing the Option button essentially inverts the selection of those scopes. And for the most part, we use that to write these exceptions. That is, I'm going to press the Option button and make a change. And instead of writing to all queues, it's going to write that one change just to the queue I'm in. And that's why it's important to have access to that button all the time, because as you're programming, you're making adjustments and it writes up and down the queue list. And then you get to a point and you want a specific one-off change, and there's a number of ways we can choose to make that change. One of them is to press the Option button and essentially invert this scope and write that change just to the queue I'm in rather than across all queues. I'm a big fan actually on it of saying, put your finger on the button and keep your finger on the button while you make a change, and then take your finger off and you're okay. If you just press it momentarily, it will lock on and stay on until you press it again. But if you press and hold, it's a non-latching. And for that point, I think it's safer and easier to press the button here, keep your finger on it. You get a nice green warning on screen that you're doing it, and you're not going to accidentally, because you can do an awful lot of damage at that point to your show file if you were to leave the Option on by mistake. So in the previous version of software, there was one version of this scope. So where you've got these rows of scopes, there was only one of them. This version of software allows you to divide the console into what we call sections and treat each of those sections slightly differently. It may be that your principals you put in section A and your band in section B and chorus in section C, and it allows you then to define some different rules depending on which section you're handling or which type of performer on stage or musician you're dealing with. And that extends to auto-update rules and scopes and all sorts of things. It was one of the sort of limitations in that you had a set of rules, but that set of rules was applied across the entire console. And quite often it was a case of, look at the band, I want to do something different to them. I want to turn auto-update off. I want to manually mix the faders. I want to do something else. And it gets quite complicated when we talk about relative groups and how we then handle relative dB controllers within these sections, within relative groups, and we'll get into all of this. But that's the sort of scope. But they're all act the same. The next scope down is the player scope. So when we get into players, you can again define what the differences are going to be between the players that you're going to use. And for the most part, if I'm playing a role and you're playing a role, it's going to be the creative EQ dynamics-y parts of it that are different. Structurally, aux sends for foldback or for effects, input patch, group routing, doesn't matter who's playing the role, those things will remain the same, probably. Not necessarily all the time, but probably will. And this scope allows you to define, when you create a player, an alternative player for a role, what the creative differences or channel differences are going to be for them. So that's that bit. When we get to players, you'll see that that scope is set once, and once you get into players, you cannot change it without deleting all your players and start it again. When we built the software, we tried to make it dynamic, that you could make adjustments. It just got too complicated. It was too difficult. That's the compromise, I suppose, in having the function, is that you're going to make a decision. In reality, I don't think it's much of a compromise, because it's going to be a pretty set thing that you do between players, EQs and what have you. I think the extension of that, I suppose, is if you're doing a show that has a young cast, that children that can't do 2 shows a day, got an A cast and a B cast, very early on in rehearsals, you may start generating players and have player groups, so you can then switch between cast sets, as it were. The other point, once a show opens, is depping musicians, different drummers, different whatever. Players isn't just limited to what you might consider principals and cast members. Depping musicians, people have different guitars and all sorts of things, and if they're in a rotation, having those things pre-programmed and using players as a way of flipping between those as well is a perfectly valid use of it. Same is true of aliases. When we get to aliases, there's some other uses as beyond the Bob has a hat or doesn't have a hat. Some other uses of aliases again, which allow some flexibility in the channel, which you could achieve in another way, but it's easier to achieve in this manner. Relative changes in cue groups. I'll put that on for now, and we'll come to the programming and the use of that in a little while. This one, the hide, control group, join, leave buttons. If I flip to this camera, normally have a set of functions behind them, and one of them is join, leave control groups. It is our recommendation, strong recommendation, that you do not use that function on the work surface in a theatre console. It doesn't play nicely with the tools that we have built to program CG membership. Fader off color. There is some sort of work surface cues where you can change, whether a channel is closed or open. The LCD button, these buttons here can change color, and you'll see actually when they're unrouted, they are unlit as well. So just sort of additional work surface cues, and this allows you to choose that color. I would have this one on. Delay in whole milliseconds. We're never going to work in an environment where we need massive, well, unlikely to need massive amounts of delay. So rather than giving you the 1.3 seconds sort of standard SD delay, it limits it down on the rotary at least to 255 milliseconds, which gives you millisecond accurate control on a rotary encoder. It has 256 steps, so 0 to 255 gives you accurate control. You can still type in values if you want something more, but it's just for the environments that we're working in theatre, you don't necessarily need such huge accurate delay on an encoder. So it's just a little tweak. And then lastly, the delete all unused snapshot data. During the process of rehearsals and everything else, you're going to make lots of decisions. And the console never throws away any of the data that you have used along the way. You know, modules within the snapshot programming, all that sort of stuff is retained. And as such, the session files can get bigger and bigger during the tech process. And then what this function does is it searches through all the data which you are not using. So when you delete this, it purges all of the stuff that you have discarded along the way and leaves your show file nice and clean. So, the infamous Q1. And I'm going to run through this, sort of bits of it maybe in more detail than others, but I think it's a useful thing to do in order to get to that point. How are we doing time? I know we're a little bit late starting, but it's all good. So, session structure with the DiGiCo, not dialing in resources that you need doesn't save you anything. It doesn't make it operate quicker, doesn't give you more effects. Decide on your session structure and then add some. You're not going to gain anything by reserving some buses. The only exception to that is if you're going to make input channels stereo, you need spare channel processing resources, this big number down the bottom left-hand side. So every stereo channel obviously uses 2 processing channels, but beyond that, I would decide what you need and then add some, because what we want to generally try and avoid is having to restructure your session once you've started. It's not that it doesn't work, it's just for neatness and tidiness, and I'm all for that. So build your session and then add some and, you know, do whatever you need to do. On a Quantum, or any of the consoles, you can choose your sample rate. In Quantum, it doesn't matter whether you're a 48 or 96, you're going to get the same capability. That's not true of all the DiGiCos necessarily, but certainly at this end, you know, if it's a 96K session, you still have all your channels. Obviously, running 96K has some other consequences, you know, MIDI channel count. So 2 physical MIDI ports are needed to build a 64-channel MIDI stream at 96K. We don't have SRC on the MIDI. So there are other considerations when going 96K. Obviously, there are some advantages, not just actually from a, you know, sonic. Latency is better at 96K. A to D and D to A conversion, double the sample rate, it gets quicker. Anyway, you can choose your sample rate and off you go. The big default all button is your friend because it, in the old school term, it flattens the console. And then you can go off and reorder your buses and all of the sort of the normal bits and pieces. So having done that, bear in mind that when you hit the restructure button, the audio engine will restart and you will lose audio. There are people that forget that and do it and go, oh, it went quiet. Funny that. But yes, there's that bit. The next thing to do is audio I/O. This is the connected hardware and racks and everything that's connected to the console. Again, you know, preparation is the key. Know what you're going to do. Build a session file that hopefully contains everything that you need. I would avoid, and this is something which maybe is historical and less relevant these days, but down the left-hand side, you get the MIDI ports related to the engine that's in the console. These are the physical MIDI ports on the back. You could redefine these, you know, SD racks connected via optics and other things. You could redefine them not to be MIDI. But I would always leave your MIDI ports in place in case you get to need them and add, down the left-hand side, ports for the racks and things that you are going to need rather than redefining them. It's just a silly point, but especially in sessions that are going to move between console models, say you start in a theatre and then it becomes a touring production and it goes from a 7 to a 10, and you need to do that conversion, it's just easier if you approach it from this method. And then audio sync. I'm not gonna go into a lot of detail about audio sync settings, but if you're on an optical connected console and you've got optical racks, you'll probably start in optical sync. Of course, as part of a bigger integrated system, there's lots of considerations, and the likes of, you know, Rob at the back and various boffins will, you know, give their opinions and advice on how you do it. You know, integrating MIDI systems and maybe digital wireless, you have to think about clocking. Not necessarily T-related, it's any digital console, whether it's DiGiCo or not, but just early on in the process of building a session file, it's something to consider. The other thing that I'm a big advocate of, and this again comes down to preparation, is the labeling. The more labeling you can do, and you can label individual socket names and cards and everything, the more labeling you can do, especially for a fixed install production, it makes it easier further down the line. You know, you might be the sound designer or the #1 mixer, you might leave and someone else comes and takes over. If everything is labeled, it makes that transition between, you know, operators or, you know, #2s, #3s, or whoever it is that's on the show easier. And when there's a problem, it makes fault finding easier. Small point, but actually can make a huge difference. And actually that need to label stuff carries all the way through T programming. Before we get to Q1, label, label, label. And that's, you know, preparation and what have you. At various points down my list, when you get to this, when you have a copy, it will say save the session. Don't forget to save the session as you go, and off you go. Right, so we built that. The next thing would be, I think, to build effects. If you're using the internal effects, get them built, have a little plan about what you think you might need. Even if you haven't necessarily routed them, you know, build yourself the delays, the reverbs you think you might need. If you're on a Quantum and are going to be using the Spice Rack, you know, come in and choose whether they're Chili 6 or Naga 6 and, you know, what you think you might be using them for. Again, it's just thinking ahead, but the more of that you can do in advance, the better. The next bit's on the list about, you know, labeling your buses, you know, naming everything, naming your channels, your input channels, your output buses, giving everything a logical name. Because when you create some cues, and I'm going to demonstrate this in a minute, that name carries on to data further down the line. And for consistency and solving programming problems, it's super important, I think, that those things are labeled and consistently done. Set up the matrix. There's some additions to the matrix in this version of software, matrix aliases. We'll have a look at those later. But in terms of your basic, subgroups coming in, PA outputs on the matrix, if that's the way you're doing it, any delays in the matrix, stuff that do, set it up. The idea is we get to a point where the console passes audio. Inputs are in, they come down channels, they go into subgroups, they go to effects, they come out the output. And as a whole, it should pass audio and operate before we make our first cue. And that's sort of the point we're trying to get to here. Surface layout. Where do you want things? Are you going to, move things around on the surface? I'm a big advocate of keeping it simple. Consider these things. Don't overcomplicate the layout. Some people might, adjust it so that, the principal is always in the same place in the same fader, no matter what bank they're on. Maybe, or maybe they end up just on VCA1 all the time. There's ways of thinking about your layout, but you want to make it easy and uncomplicated, I think. And the simpler it is, again, passing it down generations of operators and people, it's just easier. Any basic processing, high-pass filters, things. Auto-update will take care of a lot of that once you start doing it. But there's no harm in having some basic things dialed in. And then on the last page, there's like a long list. Quite a lot of this applies to the options panel we were looking at earlier, in terms of just reminders of things that you might not have set or things that you should consider setting, in terms of scopes and all of those sort of things. And once you've worked your way through all these steps, you get to the point where it says you may now make your first cue, which is quite an exciting moment. And you make your first cue, and off we go. Scopes. So what I'm going to do is, we'll do it on here. We're going to open the cue list, and I'm going to actually, I'm going to label some channels. I'm going to just give these, actually, they've got some names. Oh, that's right. We've got some channels that have some names on already, and we've got some nicely unlabeled channels. So as we build some cues now and look at scopes and all those sort of things, we'll see some of these things in action. So, lost my mouse. Cue list. Scopes. Right, global scope is the place to start. And as a general rule, if you're not very experienced or don't know where to start or haven't made decisions about how you're going to do it, and I appreciate, as you become more proficient or you're a sound designer already, you're going to have views as to how you want to write and recall data. But I suppose from a theoretical DiGiCo point of view, our advice is to try and start somewhere like this with everything in scope, both to write data and to recall data, with the exception of control groups, fader and mute. That is the creative element of you pushing faders and not CG membership, because control group membership is a function of an input channel, like a VCA, but the actual physical positions of the faders in the control group section, the DCAs, is your job as a mixer maybe to operate and push, and so we don't automate that part. There will be, of course, in bigger shows and sounds on the go, I want to automate that, I'm fine, you know what you're doing. But from a theoretical point of view, this is a really good place to start. There are two columns for each section. One says recall, and that's nice and obvious. But the other says update, and that's, in this sense, our group and auto update functions. Are those functions going to automatically write the data for us? And actually, if you're going to put your trust in auto update and the systems that we have built, if you let it read and write all the data, it will do probably what you want. And there are tools to manage the differences when you need to create and program channel differences in cues. Some people, of course, will go, I never want to recall or write these things. Fine, you can take these things out. But from a starting point of view, I think globally, this is a great place to start. MIDI and GPIOs at the bottom are in. The snapshot recalls total gain, the bottom left-hand corner, is relating to if you are sharing racks between multiple consoles. So you've got front of house and monitors, both with cue lists, and you are sharing a rack, you could have a situation where one console makes a gain change, and you don't want that necessarily to affect the other, and it can do some automatic compensation so that total gain recalled on the second console is not affected by changes on the first one. It compares head amp gains and trim levels and does some clever magic behind the scenes. So that's the global scope. There are lots of other scopes we're going to look at, but that's a great place to start. Other things here, sort of base level in the cue list. Ought to update, it goes on and it stays on for 99% of the time. I mean, I can't think of many times really when you'd ever want to switch it off because you can get yourself in a mess. There is now a nice big indicator on the master screen. This new indicator panel that is nice big and green when it's on and red when it's off. You'll notice this relative changes in cue groups are sort of lit up. In the options panel, we switched the function of sort of operating in relative groups on. So that's sort of a precursor to what we're going to do a little bit later. And so that's sort of how you'd like it to look, really. In terms of getting into, granular scopes, that is changing scopes per cue, I think it's a dangerous thing to do. The console will do what you tell it to do, but we're human and we're going to make some mistakes. And if you've done some really obscure, don't recall the EQ on channel 97 in this one cue, and you've forgotten that you did it, or you did it by mistake, it just is messy and horrible. There are other ways of programming. The exception might be some pre-show cues where you've scoped out a whole bunch of things or restricted them. But, in terms of general show programming, if you're going to overcomplicate it with, really granular scope selections, I think you need to have a little word with yourself. I'm not saying it's wrong. I just think it's a dangerous place to be because, this whole thing that some of these shows go in, Broadway, West End, wherever, and run for a long time, and they won't have the same operators throughout the entire history of the show. And if you've programmed it with that in mind, making random little scope changes in individual cues is a dangerous thing to do, I think. If you want to do it, you open up the scopes panel on the left-hand side, and there's a whole bunch of things. Some of that you will use, but the recall scope, which is per cue, I haven't got any data in yet, but the per cue scope for recall and the per cue scope for group and auto update, down to individual parameters on individual channels, I think is just dangerous. Crossfades, again, I'm not a fan of, people do it, they go mad and have lots of things crossfading between cues. I'm not a fan. You can just have got too much time on your hands, I think, maybe if you've taken that approach, but it has its place. The danger is, and if people put very long crossfade values in, you could be halfway through a crossfade, hit the next button, and unless you've scoped out that one parameter not to recall in the follow-on cue, that crossfade will get cut short and jump, and it's all just messy. There are ways of programming around it if you really, really want to achieve it, but for the most part, I think it's a dangerous thing to do. Recall times are, if you're going to feed it code and have a very automated thing, maybe you're running QLab with code as your primary, engine for calling the show. Probably not for you guys so much, but it happens occasionally. Some MIDI stuff, some relays, the control by MIDI, sorry. And this is where you can set up the relationship between probably what's going to be some sort of QLab style machine with a cue list there, and then your console cue list and what the relationship between those is. If you start from day one, of course, you end up with a nice neat list, but as you insert cues and move stuff around, you need to manage that relationship, and that's where that panel comes in. Right, so let's just create a cue. And I want to just have a quick look at some of the data behind it. to try and show you some of the things that we have and what we can do. We talked about naming, and I think this is hopefully going to highlight the importance of naming quite early on, and we'll bump into more of this as we go. But in the layout menu, there is this panel called channel queues. And it allows us, I talked about this sort of spreadsheet of data, it allows us to delve in and look at the data that exists that runs the show. And at this level, we're going to come back to this panel a few times today, but at this level, it says Lav1, labeled, and if we expand it out, each of the modules being elements that make up the channel, delay, EQ, dynamics, insert, auxes, fader, mute, whatever, each have a name, and that name takes on the name of the channel when you build queues. If I go to a different channel, let's add in something that has a generic name, channel 6, you can see that each of those modules just has its generic name. But if I label, using the console, if I then label that channel, at the top level, on the left-hand side, the name has changed to reflect the channel name. But the modules contained within all have their standard generic name. Now, as we create aliases and other things, the names might become correct. But later on in the programming, if you want to go back and you open up this channel and go, a whole bunch of things that I know is Dan on stage, but also channel 6, it's actually not very descriptive. And when you leave the show and someone else takes over and they want to change that programming, it's saying channel 6 and Dan, they don't understand the relationship between those two things. And so from a data management point of view, it very easily demonstrates the mess you can get yourself into if things aren't labeled. Because channel 6 is meaningless unless you were there when you made channel 6 the character Dan. There are some tools we have within this panel to help, and we can rename these modules, and we can do it across big chunks of the queue list, in one go. But it does require someone to sit with a computer probably mirrored to it. We're here today with the 7 and a laptop mirrored to it. I think every production, certainly during rehearsals, ought to have at least one computer mirrored to it so that someone can sit with a proper computer with a big display and manage the huge amount of data which you're going to generate building a show. And especially when it comes into things like naming and, changing and fixing things. Not that necessarily wrong, but when someone makes a creative decision and changes something on stage, you then have to cope with that change and make changes to meet their requirement. When someone says, oh, I need to make a lighting change, they'll wait while someone gets a ladder out and twiddles something. But, unfortunately, the sound department are expected just to be ready quickly and get on with it because, well, you just push faders up, don't you? And so being able to manage that data quickly and easily with a computer mirrored to a surface is I think, essential. So auto update, I'm gonna try and demonstrate and pictorially draw what this is, because it's very different to the sort of the discrete nature of a live or another console that doesn't have an auto update type system. So if we have a bunch of queues, look at this. This is marvelous. I'd normally do this with a bit of paper, and then the advantage of doing a bit of paper is you get to sniff the pens. So normally in a non-T console, if we take, I don't know, EQ for example, there will be a discrete piece of data for each queue. And there is no relationship between these bits of data. They all are unique, and you can, of course, do some sort of edit range and affect them all at once, and some, propagate or other ways of of moving data between snapshots or cues or scenes. But that's not what auto-update really does. And if you're a computer user, I think most people here use a computer. If you use a Mac and you use an alias to a file or a PC shortcut, it is a pointer to a piece of data. So in theatre terms, what this means is that we have a bucket to contain this piece of data, and all of these placeholders, if you like, point to this one stored central piece of data that is EQ for this channel. And therefore, it doesn't matter which queue you are in, you can write a piece of data and recall it, and it will always be up to date. You jump a queue, you fire it, and it refers back to this piece of stored data. And that's really what the principle of auto-update is, that this one piece of, my magic pointer, this one piece of data here is referenced from all of these other places. And as we go in and make creative decisions in terms of affecting this piece of data, for example, aliases, if we were to do something red and we had a different EQ because he's put a hat on or done something else, what we can do is have these two point at a different piece of data. And of course, they will update themselves because they are references to a stored piece of data, and we could use that wherever we want, and that relationship exists. And that's sort of the principle of auto-update, really, that you are writing not discrete data per queue, but some centrally stored data that you can reference. When we go into here and we look at channel queues, hello, channel queues, and if I were to actually just make some more queues over here, you can see that all we've done really is generate more queues that reference a core set of module settings, the EQ, the dynamics, the delay, the input, the whatever, that is referenced from all the queues. The initial data is shown black and bold, but all the others are grayed out to show that they are essentially the same as the one before. So from a designer's point of view or an operator's point of view, you can look at that page and go, I can be pretty confident that if I fire these 6 queues for this channel, nothing will change. I don't need to look at the desk, I don't need to look at the channel, I don't need to look at the EQ. I know, looking at this, that nothing will change across those things. And if I take this channel, which is channel 1, and make some changes to it, that lav channel on the left-hand side, I put it on, I can fire up and down the queue list, and it doesn't change. And it doesn't matter where I am, as I make changes to it in the queue list, it's always up to date. Because all I'm doing is writing the same data back to that original cell all the time, and each time I fire a queue, I'm referencing back to it. Which gives us that sort of speed of operation, never having to go, I've made a change, did I store it? Did I remember to hit save? Did I, is my scope right? It's always set to recall, it's always set to update, and it's always right. And actually, for most of what you do in a theatre production, if it's, Billy Elliot or whoever it is on that channel, every time they appear on stage, they're going to be roughly the same, and for the most part, they're going to be the same. And it operates a bit like an analog desk with some extra fluff and intelligence added onto it to allow you to cope with the changes. There aren't massive scene-by-scene changes every time you do something. That's just not the way this really is intended to work. It's not the way you work. So that's sort of the principle of auto-update. If I were to, I'm trying to jump around too much here. If I come in and change the scope in here, actually let's use delays. Delays is already switched on as an exception. We were doing EQs, and EQs is set to do it across the whole thing. But if I come to Q, somewhere in the middle, Q4, and then come to here and do the delays and make a change and twiddle that. When we come back to here, cues, you can see that in Q4 the delays, it's automatically stored a different setting just for that one. I haven't had to update anything, haven't had to, manually do anything. It adds the cue number you're in when you make the change, because that is something that is then stored and is referenceable. You could reuse somewhere else. I think it's a general rule, and you can disagree with me if you like. If you're going to make a change that you know you're going to reuse somewhere else, you'd probably choose another way of doing it, an alias or something. But if it is a change which you are absolutely confident is a one-off change, then this sort of exception, this purple bit of data, is probably the way to do it. I mean, in that exception scope, we've told it if we make a change to a delay, it's going to be unique for that one cue only. But I think if you were to use the Option All button and make a change to something, because you know in that cue it's something different, I would only choose the Option All if I'm sure that, when I make the change at least, that I'm only going to use that once. If I'm going to do it another time, I'll choose another method. Yeah, so if I absolutely, so if I come in here and if I take delay off, and let's just go back to, it's a lot of jumping around on screens here, but let's go to a different cue. And if I make a change, you don't see anything happen. If I put Option All on and make a change, you see it jump in. So it achieves the same thing, whether it's set as an item in that exception scope, or you use the Option All because you know it's a one-off thing, the end result is the same. It's isolated, it's flagged it to go, this is unique, do not inherit any changes from this module anywhere else in the cue list. So now that data is flagged in Q2, without the Option All button, I can make changes to this, and it's already flagged to say you're unique. If you have accidentally had the Option All button and you never intended it, the easiest way of coping with that is to reassign the module back to where the original data was. So down the bottom here, we have this Assign button. And if I pick a module, it shows me all of the potential values, in this case for delay, for this channel that exists in the show. So the top one is the shared value, the original value that exists in most of the cues. We've got the exception that was made in Q2, which is the one that's highlighted at the moment. And when we had the exclusion set differently, we created one, and that was the one in Q4. And for the cell that we're in, we can choose which of those modules we'd like to use. So if I pick the original value, you can see it reverts. The following one goes grey because it's now the same, but it's also removed that flag that says you are unique, in which case when you make an adjustment outside of Q4, that change will propagate up and down the cue list, and the data will be the same across that parameter for those cues. Now, we generally would probably operate this on the bottom right-hand corner. It says update single. That is, we are writing changes to single cues at a time. We're not writing big changes across the entire cue list using this method. You can choose to update multiple cues at a time by picking a module. But the danger is, I think, that you're going to approach it that this is a programming tool. And I would say that this panel is definitely not a programming tool. It's a fix-it tool when you fire through the show and rehearsals and something is different. And you go, scribble on a notepad, when we get to Q3, what happened there? And you can go back and you can look at this panel and you can go, well, why is that value like that? That shouldn't be the case. So I'm going to replace that one value back where it should be, or at least it flags it in your brain and go, why is it different? The other ones down the bottom here, exclude groups will propagate the change across the cue list, excluding any cue groups you have made, because cue groups are generally built for a specific reason, multiple cues for a single musical number or something. Ripple down, which I should explain in a moment for those that don't know it, and update all. Now, update all is a bit misleading. Naughty of us to call it update all, because it's not update all. Update all is, in fact, update all instances of this module. If the module is not that, don't change it. So if you had an alias structure, we had 2 aliases, and you wanted to update all of one of the aliases with a different module, the update all would look down the list and go, do you match? Yes, I'll change you. But if you don't match, I won't. So it's all instances of this module will get changed to something else, not all cues. We spend a long time debating what buttons should be called when we build a bit of software. And we don't always agree on what they should be. No, but yeah, it's update all instances or something, but there's only room for the words update all, so that's what it is. Just to show you that in action, if I quickly create another exception there, and if I were to go, this will totally ruin my programming, but I don't care. If I go update all, and I'm in this one, if I were to update all of the ones that say lav1 with something else, let's go to the one that is lav2, you'll see that all of those instances, those modules changed over to lav2, and we're left with the one unique one that was different, that is 4. You'll notice now in the list that original data has disappeared. At least from the list it's disappeared. We can't seemingly revert back to it. It only shows you in this list module data that you are actively using as part of your show file. Current cue list, sorry. If you were to look at all channels and show unused only, you can see this one is our original piece of data. That was that whole thing I said earlier on about purging data that is saved and not used but part of the show. That top line, and again I'm in update all, so if I press that, you'll see that we can revert ourselves back to sort of a sensible position of where we are. They've all turned black and grey again, so all those don't inherit flags that say I am unique and isolated and don't change anything else, they've all disappeared and we're back to a nice sensible point of view. And you can see that appeared on the unused is the exception I made in Q2, which is now not used anywhere in the show. So it's a really powerful panel, but I think you'd end up in a real mess if you decided this was the way you were going to program your show. Well, there is this details. If I press this and press details, we have this panel that shows us the status of the flags, I suppose. So the third column, the inherit, is our flag, and you can see it's per element of the module that we've touched. So it's not the option all is not just I'm going to isolate, not going to isolate all of the auxes because I've touched it. It will be specific to I have touched aux 1, and therefore only aux 1 is isolated, and all of the other auxes will continue to track. And these panels, like this panel, are there to allow you to go, I was running the show, why did this happen? Let's go back and have a look and fix it, or go, oh yeah, I remember now, that was why I did it. You can come in and change stuff in these details panels. I don't think I've ever really done that or would want to do it. It's more of a look at it and decide what the value is or why is it different or which part of it, especially when you come down to auxes and you open up an aux panel. Where's auxes? There. And you scroll down and you can see the number of parameters that are hidden behind that one cell. And it may be one thing that you've done optional, one value changed. and knowing what that value is and where it's gone. And bearing in mind, whenever you do this, that this scope down the bottom is also relevant as to, you know, what you're doing and what's going on. There is another panel that's quite similar. Now, when we designed this software originally, we started off with this panel called module queues. And it was a way of looking at the modules that make up the queues. The problem with this panel is you can only ever look at the data for a single queue at a time. So you have to, you know, go down the queue list and pick a queue to look at the data. It, I suppose, has its place, but it's not so useful. What we're more interested in is picking one channel and then looking at what happens to that one channel across a show. You do end up with an awful lot of data to look at. There is a button at the top right-hand corner, Show Changes Only, and it just highlights where there's a change with a star. And it's a little bit easier on your eye if you're searching through a massive list and looking for that one bit of difference. Color coding just about you can still see exists, the purple star and a black star, to show it's an exception, optional change, or just revert back to original value. Right, I think next, continue that, we'll look at aliases and why and how you might use those. So we've looked at ways that you can affect the show, and we can make an optional change or change an exception, but aliases is when you know there is something that is going to repeat in the show, costume changes or scenery changes that reoccur that mean that you have to make some creative change on the channel. And Alias is a much better way of doing it. So if we go back to my scribbles, I'm just going to just lose these a minute and go black. I like this. Number 2. So that was our EQ. So the idea is we're going to sort of make sort of duplicates, I suppose, of the channel data, but we're going to be very specific about which bits of the channel data we're going to duplicate, and therefore which modules or which parts of the channel are common across different aliases. And I think it's normally, you know, a costume change. We always say Bob has a hat or he doesn't have a hat, but it's a nice, easy example. So let's lose that, and we'll say, you know, hat and no hat. So for each of the cues, oops, wrong tool, let's just get rid of all of those. We could choose what the differences are between the two aliases. So it may be that we have some cues where he's not wearing a hat, and then a couple of cues where he's in a hat, and then maybe separated. And if we're going to do an EQ change or a change of creative elements of the channel, we're going to create two aliases. One which represents sort of this part of the show, and one which represents this bit of the show. And then per cue, we can choose which alias we want to use. The normal auto-update rules apply, because where this is the EQ, these ones will always point to one bit of data over here, and these ones will point to another bit of data over here. And it allows us a very easy division or separation of elements of the channel. Modules that are excluded from this bit are shared. So let's demonstrate it. So up here, aliases. So when you first open up the aliases panel, there are no aliases in it. So your base alias, as it were. New alias. So we're going to put a hat on here, and then there are some choices to make. The first is, when I make this new alias, what should the settings be for this new alias? Are they the same as my original channel? So any EQs or creative elements I've already set, do they carry over and become the starting point for this new alias? Or do I want to essentially flatten them and start afresh? I think for the most part, if you're doing variations on character, it will probably carry over. There is an argument, especially on the smaller theatre consoles, that you might use this function to reuse a channel completely. Say, you know, Harry Potter dies in Act 1 and is replaced by Billy Elliot in Act 2. I don't know what sort of weird hybrid show we're doing, but Billy and Harry have entirely different characters with different settings, and there's no sense of carrying parts of one over to the other. So you would flatten the channel maybe and start again. But if it's a variation on a channel, you're probably going to carry them over. So that first column that says copy settings means that for the modules you're going to pick, it's going to copy settings from the original alias, and they become the starting point for your new alias. The second column, where it says update changes, which are these ones, are the elements that are going to be different and isolated between the two aliases. So if it's a tick, we're not creating new modules for the second alias. They're the same module that's shared. So all of that auto-update silliness, looking back at the data, is the same across both aliases. And where there's an X, it's going to create new modules that are isolated from the original one. So having made the selection, I'm just going to leave it as these for now, and I'm going to show you some other potential uses for the aliases function as well. We hit enter, and at that point, we've created our new alias, and it's written some new data. So if we go back to our channel list, here, you can see, if we close it up at least, in Q2, we have an alias called Lav1 hat. The channel name becomes the alias name, and if we expand it out, you can see for the elements that we had selected, it's created new modules for the filter, EQ, and dynamics, those three things that were X'd out as part of the alias creation. They're not purple because they're not flagged as don't inherit. They're separated from the original alias in terms of settings, but if we were to reuse those settings somewhere else, if I fire down to the last Q, and in fact I can do it on here and pick this. So I can go to any Q and pick an alias, and it pulls in those settings. All of the same color coding of being grayed out because it's the same, or all is the same. And of course, all those settings update each other. If you are in Lav1 hat and you make a change, it doesn't matter where in the show that appears, that bidirectional sort of data relationship exists. So if you can go to any queue, pick the alias you want to use, and carry on mixing, doing your thing. It's as simple as that. There are some other ways as we get further down it to choose the alias you're going to use. I don't know whether you would look at the script and decide early on that you're going to need these aliases and create them, or create them as you go. I guess that's down to you guys to decide on a workflow. I think once you've created them once, there are better ways or other ways of deploying them, if that's the right word, as you program the show. You can, of course, use the channel cues panel and go in there and pick aliases because it's just channel settings, really, and pull them in that way. But that's how you create an alias. Other uses for them, obviously, a complete character change. You would end up, when you create a new one, of basically making it look like that. So you end up with a completely new channel with completely blank settings, and you could start afresh and have, an entirely new use of the channel. I think on these desks, these big desks, it's less important. On the smaller desk, if you're doing a 9T show where you maybe have a limited channel count, or you want to be efficient in the way you use the surface, and when big changes come along, you can, rather than going, I need another channel for that and find a space on the surface, you can reuse something that exists. I think that's quite a nice way of doing it. These are just a bunch of tools you can choose to use them as you want. The other thing I've used aliases for is effects returns, and that seems like a bit of a weird one, But if you're going to get into a situation where you want to switch between multiple reverbs, the problem with reverb engines, whether it's external or built into the console, is when you flip a reverb patch, it's probably going to mute and start again. Now, depending on where you are in terms of input, you may or may not notice that. If you're at the end of a reverb tail and it just cuts off and it's disappeared into the noise floor, it probably doesn't matter. But if it's a drum mic or something else that's really obvious, changing a reverb patch, you're probably going to notice it. We did this thing where you take an aux send it to multiple reverbs simultaneously, you know, long tail, short tail, however you want to do it, and then use an alias on the effects return just to flip between the input of the two effects. And then at any cue in the show, you can go, this effects return is long reverb or short reverb, and all you're doing is flipping between two patches, the two effects returns patches. And because both effects are active at the same time, both have input and therefore both are producing reverb tails, when you flip between them, it's much less audibly obvious. And it's just a nice, I can demonstrate it later, but it's a nice, easy little, you know, a lot of these tools, it's very easy to put them in a little box and go, this is one tool for one little job. But actually, they are tools which can be applied to lots of different programming nuances, and you know, you can get quite creative with them and do some other things with them. So that's aliases. Where's my list of things? Right, players. So we've built a structure of a show with some channels and changes in character, if you like, with the aliases. And then you get to the point that, you know, I'm going to play the role or Andrew's going to play the role. And we sound different. We look a bit different, we sound different, but, you know, we're both capable of dancing like Billy Elliot. So you want a way of being able to manage that. So the players function button allows us to choose channel settings based on the person playing the role, but it leaves intact all of the structural programming we have done relating to the character and the cue list. So if I open up the players panel, currently there are no players, so it just exists as it is. And when we create a new player, the first thing it's going to do is give us a warning that once we have gone down this route, the choices that we have made of what the differences between players are, that is me playing a part and someone else playing a part, once you've made that decision, unless you're going to delete all your players and start again, you can't then change that. So are you sure? If you hit no, it's basically saying, are you happy about, do you want to make a change to this scope here? But if you're happy with it, there's that. If you're happy with it, continue and add the first player. First player's name is Dan. And actually at this point, nothing has changed. The show runs exactly how it is. We haven't really created any new data. All we've done is flagged this existing data to say, Dan is playing this role. And if we look at the panel here, if I were to open this up again, here it says the current player is Dan. So there's a bit of indication. Again, maybe we could have a different color that, you know, give each player a different color and off you go. No. So we've created this player and then we're free to say, well, Dan needs an alternate or understudy or whoever. And so you create a new one and let's pick on him and say, no, Andrew is playing this role. And again, it hasn't selected Andrew to be the current player. All it's done is created a bunch of placeholders to say, you know, when we switch to Andrew, we're going to make some changes and adjust his. So if we look at the session, if we look at the session and the EQ, and we'll concentrate on just the EQ for this because it makes it easy. If I fire up and down the cue list, we're going to put some, let's just create some changes on the EQ just so we've got something to look at. So we've got a change in Dan that goes between a couple of settings. And then in the master screen, if I switch to Andrew being the current player, now I have to now fire a cue for it to say Andrew is now being the thing. So I can fire the current cue here. And if we look at this, I can then make some changes so that it's got Andrew's version of the EQ. And we'll do the same for the other, that one. So we've got a pair of EQs that represent Andrew playing it, and we've got a pair of EQs that represent me playing it. The aliases stay the same, the structure stays the same, and at any point in time, all I have to do is pick the current player and hit a cue, fire a cue, either refire the current one or fire the next cue, and it pulls it back. Essentially, when you fire a cue, it will go, you know, who's playing it, which alias is it, which module I'm recalling, you know, what scopes are set, should I be recalling this at all anyway? And just the current player is quite high up in that list as to what that decision is to record the data. Player sets are handy, again, for those sort of chorus A/B switches or musician switches. So down here, player sets and being able to allocate individual players to different sets. That's sort of the great thing about players. And of course, if we go back and again look at channel cues, because I love channel cues, it doesn't matter who's playing it, this still is the same. It's still the same data, same aliases displayed in the same way, because who's playing it is irrelevant at this point. And when you assign data in here, it assigns it for the current player. So it's all nice and easy. Now, this is, I think, one of the cleverer things we do in terms of a workflow and speed of operation and things. I love this function because it incorporates quite a lot of things that we've done into one panel. And so, you know, if you're newish to this, each time you program a show, actually it'll be slightly different. But I have to admit, I've never actually programmed a real show. I've done plenty of fake shows doing this. From a workflow point of view, this one ties quite a lot of things together and is quite a good panel to work with. And it's definitely, I think, a keyboard and mouse style panel over a touchscreen panel. So I'll do it on the laptop, and it's all about CG membership. Weirdly, so there's a couple of things to check beforehand. I'm going to check first before I start that one, these are in VCA style mode because moving fader and other things are horrible. But also the auto mute is on because I think it's one of the differences in live and T is we start with this auto mute function being on. Do you all know what auto mute does? Okay. So the idea between auto mute is as we program our CGs, it will mean that we don't manually, for the most part, have to program our channel mutes. The principle being if a channel is in a control group, the channel should be unmuted. And if a channel is not in a control group, the channel should be muted because we only really want open channels that sit under our fingers in VCAs that we're actually pushing, or at least are on the surface or part of a member. So having this auto mute on means that our channel mutes are automatically going to be programmed as we put channels into VCAs and take them out of channels, out of VCAs. And that's all it does. It just makes it nice and easy in that respect. So that is on. And so we start with our control group cues panel. And to start with, it has its sort of default names. There's no membership associated with it, but it's all default names. And this is where the ripple function really comes into its own. For those that don't know, ripple basically, if we have some data, we're going to make a change at some point, and then it's going to ripple the data down the show until it sees some data that's different. So if we make this into some sort of other sort of shape, if we were to make a change here and ripple it down the show, it would apply it up to this point. This is different, and so it would stop and not carry on past it. So as you're programming this, if you start at the top and work your way down with ripple on, you'll see the way that this gets built and all comes together. So I'm going to right-click, ripple down is on, bottom right-hand corner, and I'm going to right-click at these points, and it clears them. If I take ripple down off, just to demonstrate, and clear one of these in the middle, again, we've got some color coding to show, you know, things being the same as something before or not, and there's some other color coding in here that comes along. If I were to ripple down now and clear CG4, it'll ripple it down to Q4. 5 is different because I've already cleared it. Therefore, 6 will remain in place as it is. So you can see how that works. I'm just going to clear these out to give us a nice. And this is only the name of the VCA at this point, nothing else. Should have brought a mouse for this, doing easier. So starting top left, we have this assign panel, and from that panel we can pick channels to be put into the control group. So, for example, I could put Lav2 into CG1, and it's rippled it down through the show. And I might go, well, that's fine for the first 2 cues, and then it's not. So if I right-click in Q3, it clears it out and it clears it down. So starting from the top, it's nice and easy to sort of build this concept of a CG layout. I mean, it's really about what fits nicely under your fingers, that you're not moving stuff dramatically between faders that are in consecutive cues, that makes mixing difficult. This is a real sort of physical ergonomic planning thing, I would say. And this gives you a really nice, easy, flowy layout, a bit like an Excel spreadsheet, to see how that works. You will see down here, if I move this up here so we can just see it. If we look for a Lav1 channel, it actually lists all of the aliases that exist for that channel. So as part of this assigning the Lav1 channel into a control group, at the same time, we can choose which alias we're going to use at the point of putting that channel into a control group. So I could say, get to this cell and go, well, actually, I want this alias at this point. And then for when I fire the show, the channel's in the right CG and the right alias is also selected at the same time. So it combines those 2 functions into one. You can build predefined sets of channels, so boys, girls, chorus, whatever. In the layout menu, sets allows you to predefine sets and put channels into them to make it easier to assign groups of channels into a CG all at once. You can give names and all those sort of lovely things. And also, when we come into the sign panel over here, then you can see if I press the set 1, it just pre-picks those channels that I predefined. Like an Excel spreadsheet, I can hold Shift and select multiple buttons. No, the sets is a one-directional, one-time only. Take these predefined channels and put them into this VCA. If you then modify the set, it doesn't live update the membership when you get to the queues that use those sets. They are a programming shortcut to get things into the CGs rather than maintaining some sort of bidirectional relationship. Excel spreadsheet style, yeah, hold Shift, pick some channels, and actually color coding wise, then that makes it blue because it's like a scratch set, which we then rename. If we like that, we can then convert that into a set in its own right. So having made a decision in this panel that, oh, I like that group of channels, I might use that again, rather than going to the sets panel and going, well, what was in it? You've already made the group, hit the button, and it creates a set for you with those channels selected. So, so that's that. There's one really important part of this, and these buttons I'm going to show you are a result of someone programming this and then having some quite big problems, in that when you are assigning CGs in the state that we've been doing and assigning aliases, you are, by virtue, assigning channel settings while assigning the control group, because it goes, I'm assigning this channel in and use this alias. And this alias has a bunch of channel settings associated with it. Now, depending on the order that you program, if you've been and made a load of exceptions and then assign your CGs using an alias, you are in danger of overwriting exceptions you've made, because it's going to pull in a whole bunch of channel settings relating to that channel and the alias being selected. So down in the bottom left-hand corner, when assigning single channels, include all settings, aka alias, or should I only be writing the control group membership, which is one very specific part of the channel. So depending on the order that you do your workflow, if you have built a whole bunch of things into a channel and then go and try and change CG membership for that queue, and you're changing assignment on that channel or picking an alias, you are in danger with that all settings button of overwriting exceptions and flags that you've written. Because flags are associated with, queue data, and if you write that queue data with something else, you are going to overwrite, as we've seen, don't inherit flags. So if you're in doubt as to what you're doing and you really do only mean CG membership and not alias selection, the assignment that is based around what goes on down here and the options you might have, just consider the state of that CG membership versus all settings button. It's a hard one to explain, but if you're in all settings and you pick a different alias, you'll overwrite any exceptions you have made in that channel already, because you are overwriting it with a new set of alias settings. Sort of the easiest explanation I can give, I suppose, for it. If you've got a big show existing and you're making sort of little CG membership changes, it might be safer just to put that into the CG membership state so that the change you make is only going to affect the fader module, because the fader module is where the VCA is applied, and therefore EQs, dynamics, auxes and things will be left alone, and you're only going to change the VCA membership, yes. Yes, it's very dependent on what in your alias is changing. If auxes are... Yeah, no, you're right in that if your alias here, the inheritance between them doesn't include something, it doesn't matter what alias you're in. It's not going to make any difference if you've done an exception on your auxes and you pick another alias, because the auxes aren't going to get overwritten. But if, for example, you've got an EQ exception and you pick a alias to bring in that changes the EQ, yes, you will overwrite it. I mean, it's quite a complicated relationship, but I think most exceptions do come down to auxes and things like that, because it's, a specific effect, a foldback speaker or something at that given time for that one cue, rather than exceptions on EQs are pretty rare. And I would say that if it's exceptions on EQ changes, it's probably going to be an alias anyway, at which point it works. And all settings brings in the right settings and everything's hunky-dory. This channel is already in a VCA. Are you sure you're putting it into another one? No. You can have it in two. You can have a channel and as many VCAs as you like. Well, yes, and that's why the warning exists when you have a double assignment. But there's nothing invalid about it, because you might have a drums VCA and a band VCA, and drums are in both because that's the right thing to do. That's not so much of a problem, because you're not going to be doing unlikely to be doing aliases and things relating to bands and what have you. It's where principals and active cast members on stage have settings changed because the director is going, oh, it'd be great at this point if this happened, and you go, oh, shit, it's going to make this change. And then he changes his mind and you change some membership and you've overwritten something that you've done. They're the things to watch for. In reality, maybe I'm making a bit more of a big deal of it than thingy, but I know this button exists because a well-known sound designer did a different workflow and got bitten quite badly and overwrote a whole bunch of programming he did because he approached it from a different perspective when he started the programming. So that's why I highlight the fact that this button exists, I suppose. There isn't actually very much undo at all in our workflow. Or sort of history where you can go, shit, wind 2 steps back, what did I do? Even the channel undo function is like when you select a channel, there is an undo button on the work surface somewhere. Yeah, there is. And when you pick a channel and you start making changes, it remembers all the changes you make to the channel. And then you can like A, B, what was it like when I selected the channel and what's it like now? But the moment you pick another channel, it forgets all that and starts remembering again. So it's a bit dangerous. The other thing to consider is that while, actually in terms of aliases and all sorts of things, while we're talking about manually dialing changes in, it doesn't matter how those channel settings get into the channel. It could be presets or whatever, copying between channels of the copy function or the presets function. However the data is put into that channel, the auto-update rules will apply. So you could end up with some presets of, this is my base setting as a safety mechanism almost, of this is my base setting of, Mary Poppins or Billy Elliot or, whoever. And at any point in time, if you're in that channel and you pick that preset, it will recall those settings, and according to auto-update rules, it will apply those settings across the show, which is a good thing and a bad thing. It gives you that alternative mechanism to get yourself out of trouble if you've done something and applied something and you don't have that undo feature of what did I change. But again, presets is a thing where unless you're going to go back and update the preset might be out of date if you've made some changes and decide this is my new normal. Right, the matrix. Actually, we could probably do matrix aliases as part of this, which is a new bit. Standard crosspoint matrix. In live, you get level cross points, and in theatre we add the delays button, which gives you nodal delays. A word of warning, I suppose, these are cross-fadeable, but it's not something you really want to be doing. It's not a time axe, it's not going to track, it's not, we don't have the maths processing really to do proper time-based crossfades. It's incredibly difficult. So I would more consider these to be snapshotable, queuable, and especially with the aliases function, it probably helps in that sense in terms of the programming. But so while there are crossfades, doesn't necessarily should try and use them on the delays. So that's that. When you pick a cell, there are some controls down the bottom. You can enter delays absolutely or relatively. So if you need to add a bit time, you can do a relative change across nodes instead of doing them absolutely, which is nice. the way we do, well, I guess most of you are DiGiCo friendly anyway, but the way we do matrices is probably quite different to some other consoles. But yeah, inputs coming down the top, outputs horizontally, no, vertically, and matrix outputs being horizontal across. And you pick your cross points, you dial it in, and happy days. The outputs then feed the matrix output channels, which are then, processing and what have you on the output. So these get fed from the sum through the matrix. So that was that bit. Of course, you can make snapshots, but the matrix alias is the thing. So the idea of aliases on the inputs is a bunch of predefined settings that you can reuse, and if you make a change, it updates the other versions of them. It's exactly the same here in the matrix. So you can pick your input, internal groups, let's just pick something to come in. And then aliases, we've got, it's the same sort of panel, we've got one alias as it stands at the moment. A new one, let's give it a name. Again, you've got a different scope selection as to, is it a complete change with a new input? A lot of people say our matrices aren't big enough. It's not necessarily that you need the whole big matrix all the time, and reusing elements of the matrix might do. But yeah, do you want the input to the matrix channel to be shared across the different aliases, or is it just the parameters contained within the matrix that are going to be different across aliases? And then for each queue, you could pick, so if we come into the assign aliases, I'll drag this over a little bit, you can see here, if we pick one, we've got our alias selection, and that will pull with it, either the input patch if it's assigned, or the matrix level and delay parameters for the given alias. And that's done per matrix input. It's not like a global matrix, it's just done per input to this matrix. There were a couple of questions that happened over lunch. I'm going to repeat just for the benefit of everybody, because often a question is good shared, not just good to myself. So question about going to 1528. There is nothing really in 1528 that is going to stop your old session loading in. As with everything DiGiCo, going backwards again is a problem. Once your sessions become a new version, it won't load back into an old version. And there is very little in 1528 that is significantly different in a change, but there's one thing we're going to look at. Templates will still load, and still great way of, if you have a house template that gets you 50% of the way to Q1, that's still a great thing, because it saves some of the boring racks and infrastructure stuff, which is the same in every session. Like I said before, it doesn't matter how you get the information into the console. Once it's there, you're halfway to making Q1. So that's all good. Yeah, and if you're doing 1528, don't forget to get the new download of offline software to go with it, obviously. So that's all lovely. So there are three things, I suppose, this afternoon. We're going to first look at the new features in 1528, the new features we haven't looked at yet. A quick run around mustard bits, just for those that aren't so familiar with it, what mustard processing and the quantum engine, not mustard, quantum generally gives you. Mustard is one of the features. So a quick look at that. And then a quick run through Clang for those that haven't seen it or don't know what it does, because I think it's quite interesting. It has some applications in replacing maybe aging Aviom systems and other things. And there are some real benefits to musicians for having it. So we're going to have a look at those. So sections. So one of the criticisms, I'm going to try and pay more attention to online people, so they've very patiently stayed with us. One of the criticisms, I suppose, of software today has been that you have to treat all the channels in the console in sort of a similar way. You're going to make some rules. Unless you're going to get granular with scopes, There's no easy mechanism for going, these channels are part of this section and do one thing with them, and these other channels do something else in a different section. So we have invented, as we do, something else. And in the cue list, there is now a sections panel. And what this allows us to do, channels start in no sections, so base rules apply, existing as it operates now, previously, worked. And now you can add channels into sections and apply different rules based on sections. The one caveat to this, or thing to bear in mind, is that if you're going to use relative groups, channels have to be in a section. Those channels that are going to be applied using relative groups. But otherwise, it's just an easy way of defining some different rules for different types of channels. And you can do it, you know, obviously just pick some channels and do whatever, or I'm just going to stick everything into section A just so I've got some stuff to play with. Down the bottom, oh, this is this one, isn't it? Down the bottom of here, I can find the right bit of screen to scroll, is the section scope. So if we think of the way the scopes apply, at the top level, we've got our global scope, the thing we looked at to start with all the everything enabled apart from control groups and what have you. And then coming down from that, we hit the section scope. And here it's like a duplicate of that global scope, but it's per section. And we could then say, you know, unfortunately, I would like to be able to label my sections before anybody else says it. Gonna get in there quickly before someone criticizes. I would like to be able to label them. But you know, my band section or my principals, I might choose to treat differently. And so we've got the same recall and auto update, essentially, checkboxes per module for each of these. And we're generally talking input channels with sections. We're not talking any other channel type. It's input channels. I think that might change. We might end up putting control groups and other things potentially in some other sections, depending on what feedback we get from users. And I think until people have used some of these functions and had a play with them a little bit, whether it's offline or in a real session or a real environment, you know, it's hard sometimes to make those sort of judgments. But the principle is we can divide things per section. And generally, this is people wanting to treat band or orchestra differently to principals or chorus. And that's generally what we get requested. So the great English, that's generally the request that we get, is how do I treat these things differently in a bigger sense. So in terms of the scopes, I've actually prepared, I'm going to put it under, this is really old school, I'm going to put it under here. If I sort of do this, the flow of how things work is we've got the global scope, and then the software says, well, am I in a section? Is the channel in a section? And if it's not, it goes down to where we know, which is the granular per cue, per channel sort of scope parts that we know and love. And so if it is in a section, it then gets asked a further question. Is it in a cue group? Have we made cue groups in order to do relative changes within a group? If we haven't, it passes down to that scope that we were just looking at here. So that's it, it gets passed through that scope. But if it is in a group, there is then another set of scopes for the groups and some controls about how we do it. So it really gives you a lot of, that seems complicated, but a lot of flexibility about when I hit a cue or a cue group, what are the actions that are going to be taken, or how is the recall or update going to be affected. I will make this into a prettier picture and include it as part of the documentation, which I email to everybody after the event. But that's sort of the workflow. It will always end up in that granular, you know, in this cue, this channel, the EQ is not going to recall or something, but hopefully we've all avoided that anyway. So I'll leave that up there for the minute. So that's the section scope. And then we come into the topic of Q groups, and this was a result, the Q group function was a result of a rock and roll based show, We Will Rock You, I think, where there was a need to, for a single musical number, have a group of cues, which might be verse, chorus, whatever, mix in a bit more of a band rock and roll style within a group of cues that represented a single musical number. And the idea being is you can enter this group of cues, you can make a change, and that change is generally temporarily but relatively applied to that controller in the following cues within the group. So if you push the fader up or pull the fader down a little bit, that delta offset was applied relatively and probably temporarily across the group. You had the option of updating the group and saying, yes, I like that, store it, and it would write that change permanently. But in each night, you know, Brian May's mum might be in and he's giving it some, and he's a bit loud, you pull it down, and that change is then relatively applied across that little group of cues. That was the principle of what the function did. In this version of software, as well as, you know, and that was a problem in some respects in the old version, because you made a group of cues, that applied to all the faders in the console. And although you were only really probably using it for the band, you had to be careful about what you did with principals and whatever, because they were still part of this group. Now that we have sections, and then we can treat sections differently in terms of this relative function, that problem goes away, and we can now mix the band without worrying about messing up what the principal faders are doing. And that's the idea. So, I'm going to make some standard 10-cue show, if only that were the case. Groups. So this is still exactly as it was before. We can make groups. In the old days, groups had to be consecutive cues, and I think for the most part, they probably still are. But you can make groups of cues that are non-consecutive. I don't know, maybe, you know, curtain call, and there's a reprise, and then there's a second curtain call, and you can make them into a little group, so whatever you did in one applied to the other, or something. But generally, they are considered consecutive. So let's just call this group Dan, and we'll change the members. No, we won't press that button. Change the members and stick some things. So we've made a little group, and there's some new buttons in this panel now. That scope we were looking at, this one, we did the section scope, but if they are in a group of cues, there's the section group scope as an alternative scope for the group. And that is, every group can have a different scope. I mean, you probably won't, but you could if you wanted. And so the group section scope is, again, it's the same set of functions you have, but we're saying for this group only, these are the scope settings that I want. You've got the global scope, and then you've got this scope. So that's that scope, and every group can have a different scope, but I'd advise against it, really. There are some buttons at the bottom that allow you to copy scope. So once you've got a scope that you like, you can use that as a basis to apply it to other groups. But yeah, so we've got the ungrouped section scope, which was the section scope, just called section scope, not ungrouped section scope, but that's that one. And then you've got the section scope that you could copy from another group. So that's one element of it. And then, because we're sort of in groups to do relative functions, and that's sort of the point of what we're trying to achieve, I know Rob's going to love this one. Where's my mouse? For each of the groups, you can choose per section which DB controllers are going to behave in this relative function. Now, in the old days, it was faders only. You know, that was the only sort of DB controller we handled in this relative function. I think there are very few cases where, you know, the gain of an EQ, being a DB controller, might want to be applied relatively, but our job as a manufacturer is not to limit or dictate where these things should or shouldn't be. If we can apply this function to DB controllers, we'll give you access to the DB controllers, and it's your job as designers and engineers to decide based on an individual show where you may or may not want to use them. They are all switched off by default, and then you can enable them as you need them. I think, maybe aux sends for, effects within a very specific musical number where you want to, have some weird, wacky, effect sends, or might be the case. But I think for the most part, we're still talking about faders. We're not talking about lots of other wacky things, dynamic threshold controls being applied relatively across a group. It seems unlikely. But once we have a mechanism to handle DB controllers, it's relatively easy for us to apply it across a selection of controllers, and that was sort of the point. But I think maybe we should try and demonstrate this stuff in a sort of a faders. I think faders are a nice, easy way of doing it because everyone can see. And I'll point this camera down at these faders, maybe move it over there and do something, and create some groups and show you the relative action in action. Yeah? If I just push these up for now, we're within auto update, and you have to believe me when I'm moving up down the queue list, because I can't show two things on screen at once. But that's moving down, and then I'll hit, I'll need to turn on the relative function for this, scope. So when we create our group, this is a question about non-consecutive groups, which is sort of unusual, but does happen. We could have a group that is, I call it top tail, change members. If I do it here, a group that's called top tail, change members, and put, I'm in the middle of doing it here as well. It's not going to like it if I do that and that. So here we can have a group that is two queues that are separated, but actually that same principle is that I could be in the first one, make a relative change, but not store it. And when I get to that second queue, that temporary relative change would be applied. Absolutely, yeah. If you've pressed update group, it will write that change to all members of the group as a relative change. You update current if that queue within the group needs to be different to the other queues within the group. But if the change you want to make applies, the relative change or absolute change has to be applied to all members of the group, you'll press update group. I mean, for the most part, I think this is very much a fader mixing exercise function. It really is. But I think auxes are the only place where it might get used somewhere else. I mean, honestly, as a manufacturer, the moment you don't give somebody something, even if they probably never use it, the moment you don't do it, there's one person who goes, yeah, but I want to do it there. So, yes, it probably will be just faders that people do this for. And I think the section specifically relating to sort of this function is, band. I can now do my relative mixing, and it's all great. I can have my principals just stay doing auto update, and group relative function doesn't touch them, and it's all. And I think that gives people, whether they know it or not, I think it gives them what they want, and it removes a level of complicated programming that people have done to get around the fact that the console didn't quite give them that simple level of flexibility. And I realize it's not necessarily an easy function to get your head around, but actually it's really quite simple in its nature, I think. I think I would encourage people, even if you're not putting 1528 on a current show, get yourself the offline, load your session file into it, put all your channels into a section, have a play with it, or look at how you might, when you do get to upgrade your console, utilize these functions. And I know it's really hard to you know, doing it in anger when you've got a real session and real musicians and real people, you really, you know, have to apply yourself. And it's really hard to pretend to do that in an offline sort of scenario. It's really hard to do it demonstrating it to people when you've never actually built a session file for yourself. But I understand the principle of it and can teach you the principles, and then it's up to you to take those and work out which bits you like and which bits you don't. And then we appreciate there's going to be bits of it that you don't want to use, but that's, you know, that's all good. Aliases and effects. To make this easy to demonstrate, I'm actually just going to quite often do this. I'm going to delete all my snapshots and start again, because when you're trying to demonstrate lots of things, you end up with just sort of a bit of a messy session. So just to demonstrate this effects thing that I like, what I'm going to do is set up a couple of channels before creating the cues, just so it all works and does the right thing. So effects, I'm just going to do a couple of reverbs. Doesn't really matter what they are. Oops. So we've got a couple of reverbs, and then let's find some auxes. I'll take an aux, and you'll see on screen that this one aux is going to feed both of them. So aux 12 is now coming into both of these. So if you think of this in a practical sense, in the real world, this would be two different auxes, you know, a long reverb maybe, or a short reverb, or whatever. But the principle is we've got two reverbs going on. What I'm going to do is generate some noise, and then we've got some reverb going into a couple of channels, which is marvelous. And in DiGiCo, the workflow is input channels go to auxes. We don't have effects returns. Use input channels to bring effects back in. So input channel-wise, we'll use a channel here. So there we have a send and thing. Now, the problem is, if you were to do this with a single effects engine and try and switch reverbs, the send to the effects engine would be constant, you know, kick drum, snare drum, vocal, whatever. But the moment you try and change the patch on the effect, it kills it and reinstates it, and you end up with a nasty discontinuity, that's the right word, in the audio on the effects return. But in this instance, what we're doing is sending both effects simultaneously, and then if I create some cues on that channel, I'm going to use aliases to switch just the input between the two effects engines, between the two effects outputs. So I can go, in this cue I need a long reverb, in this cue I need a short reverb. And because you're switching using aliases just the input section between two active reverbs, there is no discontinuity in the effects return when you make the switch. So this may seem like a really long-winded way to solve the problem, but it does work. Aliases, that's one of them. Let's just rename that and call it long. Create a new one. And the only thing we want to change is the input patch between the two different reverbs. And we'll call that one short. And oh, scrolly, scrolly. So for this one, we're going to pick the other one. And then now for each of the cues, I'll do it on the console just to make this nice and quick. Long, 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 short. Let's go up the top, make that one short. And then as I fire down, you can see that the name changes at the bottom and the patch changes at the top, but the signal never disappears. So you could do this pretty much at any point in the show, switch reverbs and never end up cutting one reverb off before you start the next. It just sort of, I don't know, this was really, really early on in SD7 world trying to solve a problem for someone on a real show. And we came up with this and, it's brilliant. And it just, again, it's a bunch of tools. don't put them in boxes. The aliases are only for principals who wear hats, because that's not the case. There's lots of uses for all this stuff, and I think some of them are quite clever, creative little things to do, but without having a different channel and then trying to, oh, it's the same instrument, so I need to duplicate. It's doing that funny mic thing again. Duplicate the channel, have the same EQ, but then it needs a different patch, and it needs to go to the same groups. And if I change it there, I've got to go and change it here again. Same channel, same EQ. Change any element of the channel on a cue by cue basis without touching other elements of it. And I think that's a really clever part of it, actually. The quantum engines for all of our consoles add a bunch of extra processing functions, really. And all of these are on top of things. You're not sacrificing anything in the SD world to get them. They're all extra things. I think some of them for your application are probably not going to be life-changing. I think some of them potentially have their uses, especially in scenarios where you're doing, front house monitors on the same board. First thing is mustard processing. Let's do it on here. So you'll notice what looks like a Morrison sign on the console, big yellow M. But there are now on all of the channels the option of having, you can't use them all at the same time, but you can choose and pick where you use them. Both our standard SD bit of processing and mustard, which is a bit more boutique-y. And you can have them both active at the same time. So when you switch to mustard, you get an alternative, additional dynamics EQ section. So let's start with the EQ. A four-band parametric, where two of the bands can become all-pass filters, a very sort of particular specialist EQ tool, a phase change rather than a level change at a given frequency. If you're doing, double miking stuff where there's some phase differences between signals and you want to try and fix things, it's quite a good way of doing it. When you switch on mustard, or any of the mustard things, you get a little active symbol. And if I do the same thing on SD and turn on, I don't know, the compressor, you get an active for the SD. So you can see on the channel level if you've got an active ST piece of processing and an active quantum piece of processing. So that's the EQ section. There is dynamic section. You scroll this down so you can see. Again, double dynamics. You've got a gate ducker as your second dynamics processor. And then the first one, scroll this to a more sensible place. There are a choice of three. The classic is sort of DiGiCo classic. And then there are three sort of modeled analog style compressor options, a VCA, a compressor, and a FET. You could look at popular plugins and probably work out for yourself which ones they might be. But nominally, sort of 1176, LA2A, DBX160 style processing available on the channel natively. It adds a tiny amount of latency to insert this processing, but much, much less latency than if you were to turn to an external solution for similar style processing. And you don't have the complication of, I'm at 96K, oh, I've only got 32 channels of MIDI, oh, I've got to have a wave sound grid port, or whatever it might be that makes it more difficult to manage just in a practical sense. And I think there will be more that come along to fit these gaps. But they're the current options. And you can put them both on with SD. The other thing you can choose is where in the signal chain they go. Oh, there's also there's a couple of types of front-end preamp emulation, sort of tube emulation as well that you can use. One which is sort of simple, and one with some extra controls. And again, it's about adding character or a bit of flavor to your channels. The DiGiCo platform is very neutral, flat. It doesn't really add character in its own right. It's quite a very precise, tool. And this is something which, does add a bit of warmth and a bit of character and a bit something different to your channels. So they're the sort of the modeling parts we have. and you can choose where in the signal path that piece of mustard processing lives. There are 5 options: pre-processing, pre-EQ dynamics, which would be post-delay and stuff, middle of EQ dynamics, pre-fader, post-fader. So you can choose where you'd like to insert it. So you could have post-fade compression. You know, I know it's a very broadcasty thing, but you know, you could drive into your compressor on your faders, you know, for a musical style, you know, number. Just gives you some other options. So that's mustard, and that exists on inputs, outputs, wherever. And you have depending on which console, you have a certain number you can use. You'll notice some of these are grayed out. That's because they are currently being used by an insert point. If you move the insert point, you can then use that point available to put your mustard. So that was the only reason for that. While we're talking processing, the Spice Rack is an alternative effects processor. This is a series of insertable processing modules, if you like. There are currently 2 available. Who says we don't give you choice? One is called the Chili 6 and one is called the Naga 6. They sort of do a similar function. The Naga is 6 bands, each band being a dynamic EQ or, you know, compressor expander sort of type, frequency dependent in its own right, and you can place those 6 bands anywhere. You could look at, again, a plug-in from another manufacturer and sort of see what that might look like. But it's quite a cool thing, and I like the fact, certainly on this console, if I do it this side, you'll sort of see when you pick a row of controls, those controls are then mapped onto these upper master faders, which I think is quite nice. Gives you a nice sort of, you can see on this one. Sort of, if I do it here, actually that's a better way of doing it, isn't it? Look, you can see I can sort of ride them and move them and assign any of those roles. Nice tactile. It reminds me of the old Lexicon controls. You know, a bunch of faders for controlling parameters. We all like that. That's one of them. The other one, the Chili 6, is a similar sort of function. You've got 4 bands that are movable by crossovers and 2 fixed bands. But again, it's quite a similar thing. The one unique thing about these is the release shape. This function here, which allows you to control the release action. Obviously, it's based on a dynamic section, so you pass a point and it starts applying it or reducing the amount based on a threshold, and being able to change it between what is traditionally an exponential curve with no control over and making it inverse exponential makes it actually, on a release side, as you come back through the threshold, a much softer action. I think it's really nice. But you can change the way in which the release of the dynamic section is applied on each of these modules. So that's sort of quite unique for us. But certainly that inverse exponential release is really nice. You can insert them anywhere. You don't insert them here. You go to a channel in a very sort of traditional DiGiCo-y sort of way. If I just do it on an aux here, you'll see it appear up there. Insert, internal, Spice Rack. And you can see, you can pair them up in stereos and you can use them as monos or whatever. So, again, depending on which console model you're on, you'll get a different number of them. Down the bottom left-hand side, when you solo a band, you can choose which solo bus it goes to, if you want to listen to it, or you can have it as destructive solo. So just a few little things. And side chains and all the usual stuff you'd expect. A quick one of things which you probably won't use, but I'll show you because it's part of quantum processing, is what we call true solo. So this is more monitor engineer things, actually. So normally if you solo an input channel, that input channel goes to solo bus and you hear it. But if you have an artist on a pair of ears, how you hear it through the solo bus and how they hear it through their output processing may well be different. I mean, it's unlikely you're going to have a lot of processing on an aux going to someone's ears, but you could, certainly some basic things, a bit of roll-off or whatever. But there is a difference between you PFLing something, it going direct to the solo bus, and what the artist would hear if you were just to isolate that in their mix. And what True Solo allows us to do is solo something, and then by selecting a bus, we temporarily take that output processing from the selected bus and apply it to the solo bus so that you hear it in the same way your artist hears it. So it's much more of a sort of a rock and roll monitor engineer function probably, but you know, you have people on in-ears and you know, being able to take some performer who's on a pair of ears and solo something and listen to it through their output processing might be useful. You could actually do the same thing and pick a group, and I know it's not quite the same, but if you've got some weird output processing on a group or a matrix for a specific reason, want to PFL an input and go, let's listen to it as if it were coming out of matrix 4, it will take the matrix 4 processing and just paste it temporarily over the solo bus. You could leave one of these selected and then just pick some inputs. Yeah, absolutely. So that's just, and then the last bit is nodal processing. So the idea of nodal processing, and this I think does have uses in what you're doing, is that it allows you to attach a strip of processing to an individual aux send. So if you have a front of house mix and a monitor mix and they need different EQ, rather than having two channels, one with front of house EQ on it and one with monitor EQ on it, you have one channel and your channel EQ does front of house, and you could attach different EQ to a specific aux send so that when it hits the aux bus, it has different EQ applied to it. In this panel here, you can solo nodes and listen to specific aux sends and all sorts of things. And then on the right-hand side, there's some buttons that say processing, add, bypass, and remove. So I have an individual aux send selected, aux 7 here. Add processing, yes. So, and then subtly, there is a little indicator, little pink ring that says P in it. It's added around the side of the screen another EQ module, another dynamics module that are specifically associated with one aux send off one channel. And that is full multi-band dynamics, dynamic EQ, 4-band parametric, all the standard SD dynamics. And on this console, I think you get 256 of these to use wherever you like. So there's enough to build, you know, some monitor mixes with different processing if someone is really being like, I need to have my guitar EQ'd like this for my ears, when that would make no sense in the house. And rather than duplicating the channel, you can add these sets of processing to individual sends. And yes, so you would move your aux send to be pre-processing. Top right-hand corner, you'd choose that aux send to be pre-EQ dynamics. And then you've essentially got independent EQ for your individual aux sends and channel EQ for the house. And so you can apply these wherever you want them. There's a sort of there's a panel on the master screen called aux nodes. So you select a channel and then pick the aux, and it pops up the dynamics and EQ display for that individual aux send. And we call that nodal processing. There we go. So there you can see it, the processing attached to one aux send. And down the bottom right-hand corner, you get, you know, listen to the node, bypass the processing on the node, solo the node, some controls associated just with one aux send. Nodal processing adds 0 latency. Mustard adds a few samples because we're inserting a new strip of special processing, but actually adding nodal processing adds no latency to the aux send at all. So there's sort of the quantum features. Depending on which quantum console you're on, there'll be bits of it which, you know, might make more sense than others. But certainly when you're trying to manage front of house and monitors on one board, which is for your world, I guess there isn't the budget for monitor consoles in, you know, like the old days. Well, no, it's put it. I mean, we had the, there was the RE sort of style engine in a box and things, but I think for the most part, consoles are big enough that you can probably cope with most things. The one bit that might help, let's just nicely segue into the Clang. Clang's a German manufacturer that is part of the DiGiCo group, Audiotronics group. A couple of years ago we bought them, and they make immersive audio engines. And there's a lot of talk about immersive audio, but I think for your application, actually, the immersive part of it is less relevant, and some of the other benefits from a musician's point of view are relevant. And personal mixing, we have a sort of Naviom style controller. Some of this you'll have to sort of apologize is a bit marketing-y. I'll try and skip past it in a marketing-y sense and talk technical. The lower listening levels is I think one of the primary things I like about it, in that once you start taking things out of this very constrictive left-right stereo world that we have become very used to, and start spreading things around, the separation that you gain allows you to lower the overall listening level. And, you know, long-term hearing loss or long-term hearing damage based on repetitive, you know, sitting in a pit with a pair of ears in, next to a drummer or whatever it is, or being the drummer, you know, we haven't become obsessed with health and safety, but it's an important point. And actually, this allows, I would say, quite a significant reduction in listening levels without losing any clarity and separation in the mix, which reduces, you know, listening fatigue. Quite often, certainly in rock and roll, we sort of have situations where, you know, 2 hours into the gig, someone goes, "Have you changed something in my mix?" No, your ears are tired and they're closing down, and it feels like they've changed, and they might start making silly requests, but actually it's nothing to do with the mix. It's purely your ears are tired and close up and go into self-protect mode, and things sound different. And this does avoid or reduce some of those effects. It does work with any headphones or in-ears. In-ears are better. One also, I think, from our point of view with musicians, it offers some physical isolation as well. You know, even with nothing going through, you stick a good fitting pair of ears in and the outside world already is quieter. So the combination of the two things, from a musician's exposure to high levels or long-term levels of noise, is a really good thing. Magic, I think, is the answer. There's some sort of psychoacoustic principles and trickery that goes on, I suppose, to some degree. When we're locating sources around our head, there is, you know, level differences at the ears. You know, sound localization is based on a level. Our head is a bit like a big filter, so the frequency response at each ear will be different based on the localization, the position of a sound hitting our head, and the filtering effects around our head. And you end up with sort of different frequency responses for a single sound down between the two ears. And there's this thing called a cocktail party effect, which is you can be in noisy, I don't go to cocktail parties, maybe some of you do, but you know, you can be in a noisy room, but you can still focus in and listen to a quieter conversation that's, you know, close to you, or you can pinpoint it out and listen to it within a noisy environment. And it's all part of the psychoacoustics of us dealing with this immersive world that we live in naturally. And what the Clang does is sort of replicate some of that and give you that positioning cues and you know, audio effects that we are used to in the real world that doesn't exist in the stereo world that we've all, you know, thing. And that contributes to this being able to listen to lower pick sounds out, position sounds so that they don't fight. You know, bass guitar and kick drum if you put them on opposite sides of the head, they're not fighting. You know, if you stick them both center, you've got both of them trying to compete for space in this left-right stereo world, this artificial world, where if you can separate them and weirdly put one at the front, one at the back, you can reduce the level of both, but still understand both because we can still localize stuff and hear it. So yeah, I think, you know, the protection of things, people on stage, certainly rock and roll, are taking one ear out because they don't feel connected to the real world. It's all very isolating. And again, putting some of that natural environment back into their heads is a cool thing. Have you changed something? Da, 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 da. Yeah, kick and bass. And weirdly, we did some tests recently on a totally different project, linking some sites using fiber. And with Clang, we could push the musicians up to nearly 30 milliseconds of latency and still get them to play together. Because if you think about it, me talking to Rob, based on this distance, there's milliseconds of latency between us. But we don't go, oh, he's talking late. You know, we don't perceive any latency between us because there are so many other cues and reflections and things going on. And Clang, again, adds that back in. So if you have artists that moan about latency, actually just giving them a Clang system and putting shit around their head makes it better. So that's what this is about. Controlled via an app, iPad, Kindle, computer, sort of type things wirelessly or wired. There actually is, if you've got an iPad or something, you can get the Clang app for free. It's got some multi-track built into it. You can plug your headphones in and have a play with it. It's really quite clever. So you can position stuff around the head on a sort of a plane round you, and you've got a vertical up and down plane where you can position things higher and lower. So front, center, you know, your brain goes, that's important. Put something behind, your brain automatically goes, that's less important. So, I don't know, keys. Apart from that, well, you know, whatever. But depending on the musician, they actually, by doing that, it's less important, don't need to hear it in the mix, it's not fighting for space, you reduce their overall level, it's all happy. There's a big mixer involved, you can group stuff, and it's quite clever in the fact that someone might say, I want more drums. In the background, it's going, I'll turn everything else down a bit for you. It's not making the drums louder, this relative group function. Oh, it sounds familiar, talking about relative groups again. But yeah, you push one thing in up, it maintains level and pushes everything back down to give the effect of something getting louder. It's all very clever. There's some EQ built in. The controller, which is sort of Aviom style, which you would give musicians, you can feed via Dante, give them a mix and give them control over their groups, drums, bass, whatever. And so that sort of starts to look at Aviom style solutions for theatres. There's a little aux in, so if they want to listen to their iPod in between, they can put that in. And it has, I've yet seen anyone use it, but it's got these mics built into it that add a bit of local noise of the real world around them back into their mix. You can bring a little bit of that into it as well. So that's the controller. Dante connected, headphones out. There's a control within this where you can pick the aux in and choose how much of it comes in. Yeah, you can send that back up the Dante to other people. And the same with the ambient. Those. True ambience, there's a little picture, there we go. No, there is an engine. So depending on how many mixes you want, you would pick a suitable engine. This is a new one. It's got DMI cards, a bit like the console, so you could put it on the optical loop, or put a Dante card into it, or MIDI card into it. That actually runs the same app from a control point of view. So the conductor's the big one. So Dante and 3 DMIs, depending on what system you want to integrate it into. And that's essentially a big remote control, hardware remote control for the engine. There's a smaller version, does 12 mixes. The vocal, or the vocal, as we say. It's available as a DMI card. So if you're on a, DiGiCo console and want to throw this in the back, that does all the processing. And it integrates really nicely into the Quantum and SD software. You get the control, there's a nice pretty picture, stick it on an optical loop, put it at the back of a console, some other processors. So you get, within your channels, you can integrate the control so that as a monitor engineer or just as the engineer on a gig, you can have control and they can have control as well. And when they mess it up, you can just come in and tweak it and fix it for them. Obviously, the audio goes off to the card and then comes back in to feed into auxes. We use the merge input on buses to bring the input back in and feed it into the standard aux mix. Or you could just give them Dante headphone amps off the back of the processor and let them get on with it. You know, there's lots of ways of dealing with that side of it, but the integrated control is pretty handy. And if you're doing it on a console, literally, you know, it's a really simple setup in order to add this function. But I think for you guys' point of view, you know, if you are speccing new systems and building new systems and are looking at Avium style controllers, this is an option, and it's not just another personal monitoring solution. I think some of the audio benefits from, you know, the health of the musicians, or, you know, I guess you've got artists on stage within ears these days as well, is something that's worth considering. Well, if I know some of you have got shows to do tonight, and so it leaves me to thank the Autograph boys and girls for coming and doing this. Thank you to RADA for letting us use their space. Thank you to ASD for suggesting and helping organise the event and promote it. Thank you to Amy for sorting out the lunch. I just want to say thank you for coming and listening to me for the last 5 hours. I appreciate it. I think it's really important that we, as a manufacturer, keep educating people and doing this. Hope you've gained something useful out of it. And if there's an appetite to do it again, we will. So, thank you.